it's very important to understand when you need to assert yourself and say something at the risk of alienating people, at the risk of them getting upset at what you gotta say. It doesn't matter. There's certain times where if you don't do that, you wind up doing way, way, way more work than you normally would have to on a song, and then they wind up not liking it or telling you what they really wanted later anyway. Now, let me give you some examples. If you're a mixer, okay, and this applies to anybody who's maybe a producer or an engineer, or it applies to sort of every level, but I can give you specific examples of how this happens in mixing very often. What will happen is you'll try to mix a song and you're given a song maybe that has very like a snare sound that's not so good. This happened to a mixer friend of mine recently. He's working on a song where the snare ain't that great, and he's busting his butt trying to make this thing work in the song because out the gate the recording wasn't that great. Okay, so he's working on it like crazy, way longer than he would typically have to work on a snare on a mix. At the end of him mixing the song, he sends it to the band and they say they love it. But, is there anything you could do about the snare sound? Because that was the house kit and we really hate the snare. So, is there anything you could do about it? And that's when he realized, and this is somebody who's been working for a long time. This is when I realized that when he told me this story, you never really get totally under your belt everything you need to say and ask in order to get to a place where you're not doing extra work for no reason. You have to go through so many different situations to know what could happen, but there's always another one right around the corner that you didn't experience or you didn't vocalize correctly when you're talking to somebody about it. And as a result, you're going to be having to do it anyway, again, or whatever. So don't get too hard on yourself, but what occurred to me in that moment when he told me that story was that, this stuff happens very often, and there's no right or wrong way, but I've sort of become somebody who won't even work on stuff unless we get it out in front of all the problems. So when I hear something that somebody might want me to mix, I will listen to it, and in a case that something that happened to me recently, I got all these tracks I thought sounded great, but then the artist said, hang on, there's this one extra thing I wanted to add to it, and let me send that over to you. So can you add this? So when I flew that in, and the way I always do it is always have your artist send you like a rough mix. I say artist because today a lot of artists record themselves. So, if they work at a studio, you have the studio do this stuff. But the point is you need a rough mix and you need the extra part. And this is true when you're starting the mix, so that means all the files you get, you want all of them separated, multi-tracks of everything, right? But you also want a rough mix of it because just having that rough mix will tell you if for some reason something got either moved around or slid over or now it's in the wrong place or it shouldn't be there. The rough mix will tell you a lot. So I always say, I want to hear the rough mix, meaning the mix that has everything you want in it, nothing you don't want in it. So I don't want a rough mix from a year and a half ago before you did all this ridiculous other stuff and now you're going to send it to me. That doesn't help. I need a rough mix from right now, the session you have open, and I don't care about the balance of stuff. I'm not going to listen to it to make your mix sound like mine. Like, I don't look at it that way at all. I just want to know for a certainty that everything you're sending me is all there. And I can know that if I can compare it to the rough mix, I can really know for sure. All right, everything's there. If there's some weird extra part, like when this artist I was working with sent me these extra drums he wanted to add to the song, I was like, why? I listened to it, the stuff he sent me, and the drums are off time. They sounded rushed. It's clearly like some weird electronic, it's padded, like played on a pad kit or something. But the vibe of everything else had such a groove and was so good. And then when they added this extra stuff they wanted, I was like, no shot. I will not put that in it. And before I even said that, I played with it a little bit. I did all sorts of weird little stuff I could do to basically make that feel like it was right, potentially, but it wasn't. No matter what I did, I couldn't make that work. So right there and then I put on the line a very strong statement, which is You gotta trust me. You're hiring me to mix the song. This stuff you're adding is absolutely going to ruin anything I can do. So I'm not going to mix it with this extra stuff you wanna put in there. What you did before was great. I don't know why you're doubting yourself. I don't know why you're second guessing yourself. I don't know why you think this extra stuff needs to be there that wasn't there clearly because you sent me a whole song, without it. You sent me all this stuff without it. So the thought that you think it needs to be there, it doesn't. And it's way worse with it. So you have like becoming comfortable talking about these things. When you say anything like this, one, they could say, okay, I'll take my business elsewhere. You're fine with that. You have to be fine with that because I couldn't make it work with that stuff in it anyway. So I wouldn't assert myself in that to that degree if I had any doubts that I could make it work with that stuff. That stuff was like a little kid playing drums they wanted to add to a song that sounded like it was solidly locked and what a good groove to it, and it had such it was great, and now we're gonna add a little kid playing drums? It sounded terrible. So, it literally sounded like a five-year-old playing drums, and I've seen some good five-year-olds, so I don't mean to put down anybody out there who's a five-year-old playing drums, but you get my point. That's the kind of thing that I think a lot of people need to get more comfortable with. If the mixer friend of mine said, "Listen, the snare sound is terrible. Are you okay with me changing that out to another sample?" The guy in the beginning would have said yes, and then he could have spent way less time mixing the song to try to make that snare work. He would have just replaced it with some good sounding snares, and it would have been game over. He'd have been done with that mix way quicker. The band would have probably liked it more. So he wound up overworking basically because he didn't ask certain questions. This can happen to anybody. So it just shows you if it can happen to an experienced mixer, it can happen to anybody. And a lot of the time, there's got to be something here where like there's a mental aspect of it. Depending on the last thing you worked on and how much of somebody like how much they were willing to bend or change what they were doing on the last project before this, that influences your next project. That's why it's important to sort of clean slate yourself every time you do a project. Because if somebody you worked with one project before didn't want you to change anything, now you come into this one and you don't want to change anything. But you should have asked the questions. If the person you worked with before would have gotten pissed off or upset because you asked the questions, so this one you're not going to ask any questions, that's a ridiculous thing to do. If the last mix you did, nobody liked it, this one you can't be assuming no one's going to like it. That would be a ridiculous thing to do. So all this stuff comes into play so often where we can't let the last project influence this one. When I did a mix for like one of those mix contest things, and I really, I had that epiphany learning moment where I said to myself, when there's a real producer on the song who's been paid to produce, and they have taken like that means to me that they've taken the time to go through and get sounds to be the way they want. As a mixer, they just want you to put it together in a way that brings forward everything they've done, but don't be changing it. Don't be doing like special, weird, unique stuff that you might do as your thing that you do. I shouldn't have done stuff like that when I gave them the track back for this mix contest because they didn't want that. They wanted it to be this producer's version just mixed. And that is a very different job than when somebody like a lot of the people I work for, when they just record themselves and then they want someone to take this to another level and they're okay with me doing my thing, that's where I might mute certain things right before it drops to give it like a little more emphasis. I might, add some vocal effects stuff that would like wasn't there or like a call and response vocal that wasn't there, or maybe I'll do certain things to make parts sound bigger and I'll really not look at it like I have to just play with balance and fader volume, and that's it. Like, I wouldn't look at it the same way, really, because that's the thing I realize is that when people don't have that producer built into the project, they want someone to be it, or at least a lot of the people I work with want someone to be it, and this is where it comes down to communication. If they don't want that, you can find out in communication. If they do, you can find out through communication, but you sort of have to have a little bit of communication. You can't just accept the tracks, start working, and then talk about it because you're in for a rude awakening if you do that. This is also where guys like Vance Powell have said, they like to front load the conversation about what is possible later, because Vance is not someone who mixes in the box. So he's using a console, and it's not going to be able to make tweaks. In 2 weeks we'll make a bunch of tweaks. In 2 weeks we'll make a bunch of tweaks. He has his own way of doing that by mixing through his console the way he likes, then printing stems back into the computer, then being able to tweak the stems later that way. But it never goes back to the console. So he basically front loads the conversation by saying, if you want stuff changed, like, we can make tweaks, but you got to tell me immediately, or the band has to be in the studio. Like, there cannot be a big bunch of time between when I give you a mix and when you want it changed, and then you expect it to sound exactly the same way. People who mix in the box can do that sort of thing. So that's where people get very kind of, no one knows what to expect, or rather people have these expectations that you can make a tweak from today till tomorrow constantly every couple weeks or something in order for them to achieve the perfect hi-hat level or whatever it is they're going for. So there's not like a right or wrong here. It's just more communication is always better. It'll also kind of show you who you're dealing with, because if people can't communicate what they want, they're not the easiest people to work with. And if people communicate what they want, but then what they wind up wanting is the exact opposite of that, that's also sort of human nature. You got to kind of be okay with people changing their mind and stuff like that. It's part of it. You can't be upset when people are human. That's a human thing. But at the same time, they're not the easiest people to work with, people who change their mind all the time. When it came to stuff like for my own stuff, years ago, I used to have a guy mix it, and I only had this particular guy mix it because I trusted his opinion. So if I had a tweak or something here or there, it was usually little tweaks. The guys I would work with before that, I would tweak the mixes like crazy because it came down to the fact that I didn't trust them. That's really all it is. You have to trust the person you're working with to give you the best thing that they can give you from their opinion. That's what a mix is. A mix is the opinion of the mixer. This is how the song should sound, in my opinion. That's what a mix is. So, and this is also why Steve Albini, a guy who looked at himself as someone who just wants to give what the band is giving. He wants to give it back in a recording. That's why he stated many times that he was very uncomfortable mixing something remotely. Like, you guys record it, send it to me, and I'll mix it. He didn't know what to do a lot of the time because everything in his being was like, if I wasn't there while this was recorded, I don't know what you guys want. I don't know what the aesthetic of the band is. I don't know how loud the guitar should be in relation to whatever else is. I don't know if the bass is the lead instrument. I don't know if you guys like these kind of things in terms of drum sound, or like, he was too uncomfortable making all those choices for the band. And there's plenty of guys out there, guys that were considered mixers, that everything used to basically go to a handful of guys. And as time changed, that handful of guys changed to different handfuls of guys. But, that's what it was. It was, somebody's going to produce the song, and it doesn't matter how great their mix is, they're going to send it to another guy to mix it anyway, because that kind of secured the investment of the people recording. So for like a record label, this has happened mainly in the record label game, like with major labels. The record label put all this money into stuff. They pay, they have a guy produce it for good money just to cover their bet. We got to send it to this mixer guy because he's made hits and this has got to be a hit. Doesn't matter how good that producer created their mixes. That's why you get stuff like Butch Vig's mixes are great, but we send it to Andy Wallace anyway. That's where this stuff came from, and it happened a lot. It happened for plenty of bands. So it became a thing where producers would learn not to sweat over the mix so much. It's going to someone else anyway. It was a very rare case where guys would be the producer and the mixer. Didn't happen that often. It happened with a few guys, like Eric Valentine, for example, was not only the guy who would engineer it and produce it and also mix it. Brendan O'Brien very often did, he always he had his guy Nick DiDia do the engineering on them, but he's part of it. He's there. He's the producer, Nick DiDio was the engineer, and he was the mixer on a lot of stuff. And prior to that, Brendan O'Brien was the engineer, like on Blood Sugar Sex Magic, he's the engineer, and Rick Rubin's the producer, but then he also mixed the album. So I find it particularly unique, those cases. The rest of the time, it was, doesn't matter how good this producer does on this mix, it's going to be mixed by somebody else. So why, sweat on it so much? And when it comes down to the world we live in today, where none of that stuff happens for the majority of the people who are making music, we have to look at it like communication is key. And what we do, a large part of what we do, is sort of unknown to some people. Like there's bands out there, obviously, who know you can change the sound of that snare very easily. But having that conversation, for some reason, is elusive to some people. It's hard to have. They can't pin it down. They can't get, maybe the drummer's a different guy than the point person. So just getting him to talk on the phone is tough. Everything you say gets passed through the vocalist or something because he's the point person between him and the mixer. I don't know what it is. That could be it. But I've said before also, it's very important to have a point person in terms of somebody who communicates the entirety of like revisions or thought process to the mixer, because it's very hard when you have the drummer telling you to turn the drums up, the bass telling you to turn the bass up, the guitarist telling you to turn the guitars up, the vocals. How are you going to do anything with that? Okay, everything's now up, so nothing is up, right? So that's the problem. But there's a lot to this. It's just, I find communication is key. Getting out in front of potential problems is key. Don't sit down to mix something already sucks before you start, because there's nothing you could do in that case. That's that weird situation with the extra drum tracks for no reason, where I was like, these make everything terrible. And it's also that way, if you're fighting a weird vocal, like let's say you have vocals that sound great, but now all of a sudden there's this counterpoint thing that comes in and it's all over the place, and like, you'd be surprised how often that extra vocal track is actually from another song altogether, somehow got unmuted and lumped in with these tracks. That's why that rough mix will tell you, if you go to that spot in the song, I don't hear that ridiculous other vocal thing that doesn't make any sense in this song. Is that supposed to be there? And then they could tell you, no, that thing wasn't supposed to be there, before you fight with trying to put it in the song. You got to have those conversations, I sort of look for, what am I going to have a problem with? And that's what I write down, that I got to go over this with the band before I start. Because before you start is really your only leverage, in a way, to get out of there if it's not something you want to work on. Whereas once you start, now you've invested time, now you've invested effort, you could have been doing other work and you're doing this. You are now more likely to want to push through and make everyone happy, but you won't be able to if you're fighting green monsters sounding ridiculous. So you got to get out of there in that situation. That's why you got to figure it all out before you start, in my opinion. The guys who have assistants, sometimes the assistants will tell them, we have to deal with this. But guys that don't, like most of us, when I'm doing my prep day, which is a different day from the mix day, that's the day that I will go through while I'm prepping, and I will write down what my issues are going to be, if there's stuff I need to talk about. Now, if the band knows what they're doing, they track solidly, then there's nothing to talk about. It's not always this way. It's just sometimes it can be, and avoiding the conversation to try to, be less confrontational or something never helps. That's why being a little bit confrontational in this business is helpful, because you got to bring those things to a head so we can talk about them and then get through them. It doesn't help to just sort of be passive about it, do the work harder, and then they tell you, hey, that snare is terrible. I know it's terrible. You know what I mean? That doesn't help. Those extra weird drums are getting in the way. I know. It's why I don't want them in there. You're forcing me to have them in there. You get what I'm saying? You got to get out in front of it. So anyway, you guys got this. Talk to you guys soon. Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut Studios. Take it easy.